All right, 14.5, religious violence. Uh, Here we go. Here's your vocab. I'll go ahead and let you hit pause and copy this down. And when you are ready to continue, just go ahead and hit play. So, the question we need to answer today is what were the causes and consequences of religious violence, including riots, wars, and yes, witch hunts? Page 472. I'll go ahead and pull it over onto the screen here. Religious violence. In 1559, France and Spain signed the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis. Do not make fun of the way I pronounce that, because I am not French. Which ended the long conflict known as the Habsburg-Valois Wars, which was a war between Spain and France that actually occurred mainly in Italy. The two different countries fought in Italy as opposed to fighting in their own countries. France, exhausted by the struggle, had to acknowledge Spanish dominance in Italy. That's the Habsburg side. The Valois side is the French side for the last name of their respective emperors, or excuse me, kings, I should say, not emperors. The treaty did not bring peace, however. Instead, over the next century, religious differences led to riots, civil wars, and international conflicts, especially in France and the Netherlands. Protestants and Catholics used violent actions as well as preaching and teaching against each other, for each side regarded the other as a poison in the community that would provoke the wrath of God. And as we've talked about several times, albeit I'm sure that many people did believe in their religious fervor, their either Protestant or Catholic reason for fighting. Many times there were more political reasons involved than just religion that led to these conflicts. Catholics continued to believe that Calvinists and Lutherans could be reconverted. Protestants persisted in thinking that the Roman Church should be destroyed. Catholics and Protestants alike feared people of other faiths, who they often saw as agents of Satan, even before they feared those who were explicitly identified with Satan, which is living in their midst. The era of religious wars was also the time of the most virulent witch persecutions in European history, as both Protestants and Catholics tried to make their cities and states more godly. So, again, what were the causes and consequences of religious violence? So, back to the Habsburg-Valois Wars. The Habsburg-Valois Wars cost more than the French government could afford. So, King Francis I of France tried a couple of different ways to raise some revenue for these wars. Um, the first one, there's two ways. One was the public sale, or the sale of public offices, which became a temporary source of money because as people bought, as families bought public offices, they ended up becoming hereditary. And once you were in these public offices, you did not have to pay taxes anymore. So instead of creating more revenue, they actually decreased revenue because it was a one-time purchase and not a continual payment. The second way was a treaty with the papacy. We've talked about before the Concordat of Bologna. The King of France agreed to recognize the supremacy of the papacy over a universal council during that whole conciliar movement that we've talked about. And in return, the French crown gained the right to appoint all French bishops, which had a couple of consequences, not necessarily negative consequences. One, that the official religion of France, in effect, became Catholic because he always appointed pro Pope Catholic bishops, and he was also able to gain some revenue from that. Uh, and I just mentioned that. So, in 1536, large numbers of French people were attracted to the Reformed religion, which is what they called Calvinism for some reason. Um, because Calvin wrote in French rather than in Latin, like Luther, his ideas gained more support in France. So, and these French Calvinists, or Calvinists simply from France, were called Huguenots. Most of them lived in major cities, and when Henry II died in 1559, about a tenth of the population converted to Calvinism. Just to give you an idea of the number of folks in France that are becoming Protestant. The feebleness, the meekness of the French monarchy led to widespread violence. Henry had 3 sons, and none of them were very good leaders. They were often doing what they were told by their mama, Catherine de' Medici. The French nobility took advantage of this weakness and saw it as an opportunity to gain politically. Again, they're using religion, not that they didn't entirely believe in Calvinism versus Catholicism, but they're using this weakness of leadership to gain political advantage. So I digress. French nobles frequently adopted the Reformed religion, that being Calvinism. That's what they called Calvinism, the Reformed religion, as a disguise to gain independence. Clashes between Catholic and Royalist lords, those who supported the king, that is, and Calvinist anti-monarchical lords, those Calvinist lords, occurred in several parts of France. Protestant teaching started to attack the power of sacred images into question. We bring this up because it refers to a term known as iconoclasm. So the rosary, pictures of Mary, Mother of Jesus, stained glass, statues, those types of things, the sculptures of the saints that the Catholic Church holds dear. Calvinists refute as what's the word I'm looking for? Icons as other gods, right? The Bible says, "Have no other gods except for God. Love no other God except for Him." And so Calvinists attack these idols. That's the word I was looking for. These idols, if you will, of the Catholic Church in this event of iconoclasm, or this act of iconoclasm, which is an example of men and women carrying out the Reformation themselves. So that's, I guess, affected the so what of iconoclasm. Is it's the first time where lay people actually start attacking the church themselves, because once this started in the cities with clergy, it actually moved to provinces where common people were carrying out this attack on sacred images, going into parishes and breaking stained glass and tearing down statues. It was really the first time, again, that lay people attacked the church. And this struggle went back and forth. Catholic mobs defended the images. Crowds on both sides were killed in terrible ways. So this image, iconoclasm in the Netherlands. Calvinist men and women break stained glass windows, remove statues, and carry off devotional altarpieces. Iconoclasm, or the destruction of religious images, is often described as a riot, but here the participants seem very purposeful. Calvinist Protestants regarded pictures and statues as sacrilegious and saw removing them as a way to purify the church. The savage Catholic attack on Calvinists in Paris on August 24th, 1572 became known as St. Bartholomew's Day, followed something that was pretty typical. We have a marriage of the king's sister, Sister Margaret of Valois, to Protestant Henry of Navarre. So we have the King Henry's sister, Margaret of Valois, which means she's in the bloodline of French monarchs, to a Protestant Henry of Navarre. This marriage was intended to help reconcile Catholics with French Calvinists, but instead a bunch of Huguenots that were wedding guests in Paris were massacred by mobs. So people that were outside the wedding, Catholics, decided to come in and kill a bunch of Protestants. And religious violence spread to the provinces, where thousands more were killed. This massacre led to a civil war that lasted for 15 years, and it really brought France into a pretty dark time. Fields were destroyed, commercial life declined, starvation and death spread throughout the countryside. But what did save France in the end was a small group of people, of moderates on both sides, Catholic and Protestant, that were called politiques, who believed that the restoration of a strong monarchy could reverse the trend toward collapse. They felt that no religion was worth the type of destruction that they were seeing in uh, in France. Also, the death of Catherine de' Medici, followed by the assassination of King Henry III, paved the way for Henry of Navarre to become King of France, and he took on the name Henry IV. And Henry, aka Navarre, knew that a majority of the French were Roman Catholics. So, in knowing this, he sacrificed his Protestantism to become Catholic, and thus kind of saved France from more war. Uh, in 1598, Henry published the Edict of Nantes, which granted liberty of conscience and liberty of public worship to French Calvinists in 150 fortified towns, and prepared the way for French absolutism in the 7th century by helping restore internal peace in France. And we'll talk about what that means later. Uh, the Netherlands under Charles V. So Emperor Charles V, who was the King of Spain, had inherited 17 provinces that composed present-day Belgium and the Netherlands, often known as the Lowlands, or the Low Countries, excuse me. Each of the 17 provinces of the Netherlands possessed historical liberties. The only thing that kept these lowlands united was the fact that they were inherited by Charles V. Other than that, they made their own laws, they had their own commerce, each one was separate. They were not a whole country, only united under the Holy Roman Empire under Charles V. Um, as we saw in many other places, corruption in the Roman Church and the spirit of the Renaissance brought reform, and Lutheran ideas spread. So here is an image of the Low Countries, this territory here that you see, this coastal area. Charles V had grown up in the Netherlands, however, and he was able to limit their impact on the Holy Roman Empire of the, I guess, disuniting the Holy Roman Empire. In 1556, Charles V abdicated, which means he stepped down from being the king and the emperor, and he divided his territories between his brother Ferdinand and his son Philip. By the 1560s, Protestants in the Netherlands were primarily Calvinist, not Lutheran, and were more militant in their beliefs than were the Lutherans. Whereas Lutherans taught respect for authority, Calvinists said, "Screw the king, let's get rid of him." 1560s, Spanish authorities attempted to suppress Calvinist worship and raise taxes, which sparked riots. From Madrid, Philip II, who was the brother of Charles V, sent 20,000 Spanish troops under the Duke of Alva to shut down these riots. Alva went there to pacify them, and by pacify, apparently he thought that meant kill all of the Huguenots, in which he created his own, that's what I'm looking for, court, if you will, and became known as the Council of Blood, and in which one instance he executed 1,500 Huguenots. For 10 years, civil war raged in the Netherlands between the Catholics and the Protestants. Long story short, eventually the 10 southern provinces, the Spanish Netherlands, came under the control of the Spanish Habsburg forces, and the 7 northern provinces formed the Union of Utrecht and declared independence from Spain. And the north was Protestant and the south remained Catholic. But this is not good enough for Philip. He did not accept this. The fighting continued, and the United Provinces looked to an outward source, that being the Protestant Queen Elizabeth of England, for help. And Queen Elizabeth actually did help them because she feared that after them, Spain may next try to invade England. So she sent money and forces to the 7 northern provinces to help them out. Spain actually tried to invade England in response, and they got their butts kicked and the English Channel, and only about half their ships returned home. So, nevertheless, long story short, the 7 northern provinces remained united under the Union of Utrecht, and the 11 southern provinces remained Catholic. On to the Great European Witch Hunt. The relationship between the Reformation and the trials for witch hunt are complex. There are several different reasons why, a growing number of reasons why witchcraft became persecuted. Not that it's really even actually a thing. Anyway, it became, the main idea is that witchcraft used to be just a thing where witches, and I'm holding up my quotation fingers right now, witches, um, they were just seen as witches. They did what, they used their magic, again quoting, to uh, get people to do what they want, or to get things that they wanted. Whereas in this Reformation time period, this religious Reformation time period, witches became, the idea of witches became connected with demonic, diabolical. They had a connection to the devil himself. Um, yeah, good enough. A heightened sense of God's power and divine wrath in the Reformation era was an important factor in witch hunts, but other factors were also significant. We had, like I just mentioned, witches used to be people who used magical force to do evil. However, a witch evolved into witch a witch evolved into someone who had made a pact with the devil that required the witch, sorry for all the typos here, to do the devil's request. So basically, they now thought that the devil, or excuse me, a witch was a person who was actually doing the devil's work on earth. No bueno. Witches were thought to engage in wild sexual orgies with the devil, super weird, fly through the night to meetings called sabbats, which parodies the Mass, so these devil kind of worship ceremonies, and steal communion wafers and unbaptized babies to use in their rituals. I don't know who thought this stuff up, but they were terrified of witches. The sexual orgies, albeit weird, also weird to talk about with sophomores, makes sense because one of the evils, if you will, that women were seen to have and use, as we know, back in these days, women are the root of all evil, and they are weak. But one of their demonic powers is their sexual immorality. So that's why the sexual orgies are in there. Also flying through the night on pitchforks and broomsticks to these demonic masses. Some demonological theorists also claim that witches were organized in an international conspiracy to overthrow Christianity. So thus we have trials, actually oddly enough beginning in Switzerland, where we know today Switzerland is a fairly neutral country. Not so back in the 16th century though. Scholars believe that 100,000 to 200,000 people were officially tried for witchcraft, and between 40,000 and 60,000 were executed. Obviously, a great majority of them were women. Some demonologists expressed misogyny, or that this hatred for women, their powerful sexual desires that I just spoke of, which can only be satisfied by a demonic lover. We also had some legal changes that allowed for massive witch trial, whereas trials used to be accusatorial, meaning that if I were to claim that someone was a witch, I would have to present evidence to the judge and the jury, and if it seemed that I had made it all up, I myself could actually be charged. Whereas things were changed to an inquisitorial legal procedure now, where a jury actually did the inquiring, oftentimes through torture, and I would get off scot-free. Like, I have no liability in the issue. And that's everything that I just said. If you want to go ahead and hit pause and read this, you can. Most witch trials began with a single accusation. Typically something that had to do with a female work. And by that I mean a kid got sick, animals got killed, food spoiled, etc. Things that had to do with keeping up the household. Again, was another reason why a majority of them were women. Once the charge was made, judges began to question neighbors and acquaintances, and it's not like it happened like right away. Many witches were, or witches, again using my quote fingers, were old because it took a long time to bring a case against someone to charge them as a witch. You had to have several accounts of spoiling food or children getting ill or animals dying or whatever to actually bring a case against a person. But when they did have a case against a person, they brought them in. They were brought in for questioning, stripped of their clothing, shaved, searched for a witch mark, or pricked to find a spot that didn't hurt, and then they were tortured. So we're going to completely embarrass you, take all your clothes away, shave all your hair off your head, find your witch mark, which I don't know was probably a birthmark or funky looking bowl or something. And then we're going to find a spot on your body that hurts when we poke you, and then we're going to torture you. So anyway, long story short, people became skeptical of witchcraft, and it eventually kind of died out. Here are your review questions. There's quite a few of them for today. Feel free to send me an email if you have any questions on this lecture.